first official Yarn Night. Thank you so much for being here tonight. We're very excited to have you. Before we start, I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we are meeting today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and the Aboriginal elders of other communities that may be gathered here today. So this is our first ever Yarn Night, so we're really excited. Today, and Yarn Night in general, it's basically a monthly spoken word event where we give space to share the stories of the people from the deaf and hard of hearing community. And today we have Maxine Parker, Victoria Didenko, Andrea Cooper, and Daniel Pistrita joining us as storytellers. And we're very excited to be sharing the floor with them today so that they can tell us a bit more about their personal stories. For those of you who may not know us, we're Soundfair. And Soundfair is a not-for-profit organization that's been working for 85 years committed to achieving hearing equality. Basically, our tenet is that people are more than just ears, and if we want to, we cannot just look at the physiological impacts of living with hearing conditions. We need to look at it holistically and at a person and patient-centered care approach. So we want to eliminate the negative social and emotional impacts of living with a hearing condition. And in that sense, we're doing a lot of advocacy work to advocate for accessibility and to advocate for improving psychological, emotional, and social support for people living with hearing conditions. And yeah, just making society in itself more inclusive, because we believe that people, like, having a hearing condition is not a disability in itself. It's a society that's inaccessible that makes the condition being a disabling experience. So without further ado, I'd like to start by introducing our speakers for the night. Tonight we've got the theme of the day I first knew. So our speakers today will be sharing their stories about how they came to know that they had a hearing condition and what that entailed in terms of how did they navigate this journey. So the way the night is going to run down is, as I mentioned, we have 4 speakers. Each of them will speak for about 5 to 10 minutes. I'm going to introduce them as we go. And then at the end, around 7:40, 7:45, we'll open the floor so that we can all have a conversation and exchange ideas and hopefully, yeah, just come together in this experience. So first off, we've got Andrea Cooper. And Andrea's passionate about inclusion, including access to information. Her work is in advocating for inclusive communications to reach audiences from diverse cultures with limited English literacy and with that communication disability and limited digital access or ability. Andrea is also a health consumer advocate with the Alfred Health and Safer Care Victoria. And Andrea will be speaking about yeah, her journey when she found out that she was living with a hearing condition. Take it away, Andrea. Oh, you're on mute. Andrea, you're on mute.
Okay, now it's my turn. Okay, try not to read this, but I've sort of put together my story about how I first found out and that I had a hearing problem, and also how I've dealt with it over the years. So half a lifetime ago, when I was newly married, I was having a fight with my husband, who was trying to have a conversation with me standing in another room. He shouts at me, "Go and get your hearing checked." And I shouted back, "There's nothing wrong with my hearing," and stormed out. Anyhow, I decided to prove him wrong. I really was adamant that I was going to prove him wrong. So I went to my GP and I got a referral to see a hearing specialist. The actual appointment was preceded by a hearing test. And after it, the audiologist sat me down carefully and gently and told me that my hearing was a little bit out of the normal range, that I had mild hearing loss. Suddenly, so many things made sense to me. In primary school, I'd been very aware of being slow to pick up reading. As a teenager, everybody else knew the words of the songs. How come I didn't? And in my 20s, when friends started having children, I'd be over at someone's place and the mother'd get up suddenly, oh, the baby's awake. I never heard the baby. I actually thought there was a thing called mother's instinct from one room to another. So all these things came to mind, and it was like, oh yeah, okay, I have some hearing loss. I then had a discussion with the specialist who explained some things and sent me home with a brochure. I sat with my husband, we went through things, and that was the very beginning of my journey. Also spoke with my parents, who were both totally surprised. They had absolutely no idea. But Mum said to me that I'd always been a quiet child. So a few years ago, I actually was going through my parents' papers, and I found a letter from my primary school principal when I was 10 years old, recommending I have a hearing test. So that obviously was never followed up, but it's just interesting that there'd been some sort of indicators at that level, at that age. Anyhow, a couple of years after my first test, I went for a follow-up, and it was found that my hearing had declined a little bit further. As I'd had a baby in the interim, the specialist decided to send me for a test to see if my hearing loss was inner ear or middle ear. And some of you may know there's a middle ear condition that can be triggered during pregnancy. Anyhow, my loss is inner ear, so that didn't make any difference. Also, just as an aside, having a little child and knowing that mother's instinct didn't really exist, I of course made sure I had a baby monitor. And other people may have experienced this, but the funniest thing is waking up at night and having your husband snore on one side and the baby side of the baby monitor. So just something in my story. Anyhow, a few years after that, and every test I had gradual more hearing decline. I was now divorced and I was juggling work and single parenting. And I was eventually referred for audiology to the HEAR service, which was part of VicDef, which is now Expression Australia and Expression Audiology. A few more years, and it was recommended that I would benefit from hearing aids, but it still took me 2 years to admit I really needed them. So that's not an unusual story. And then once I decided that, it took some months to organise my own budget so I could afford them. So in my mid-40s, on 1st of May 2002, I acquired my first set of hearing aids. So I've just had my 19th anniversary. Of course, at the time, they had to be the invisible ones, the inner ear ones. And I clearly remember walking out of the audiologist's rooms and hearing the whoosh of the cars going past. It was just, I mean, I'll never forget it. And going to the supermarket, discovering there was background music. And, you know, these are things from my first day with hearing aids. As an aside, as a person in my mid-40s, then getting the smaller inner ear hearing aids is one thing, but I personally would never recommend them, especially for older people. They're too difficult to handle and most expensive to maintain with batteries. It took me a couple of years to be comfortable to publicly admit I was wearing hearing aids, but really at any age we should never be ashamed and stigmatized for wearing hearing aids. I also think we need to campaign that people shouldn't be self-conscious about the hearing aids, and hiding hearing aids should not be a sales feature, as they often are. Anyhow, in my first years with hearing aids, nobody told me that they didn't make my hearing normal. So I went around presuming I was hearing everything exactly the same as someone in the normal range. And it's only in recent years I also found out that my early pattern was genetic. Nobody told me that at the time. And these are things that the audiologist or the specialist should have told me first up. And I feel that some of the impact on my life would have been different if I'd been told these things right at the beginning. Professionally, my working life has been in public relations and communications, and I was working in mainstream, but also had a specialisation in multicultural communications. And eventually I realised that my continuing gradual hearing loss was having a significant impact on me having stable employment. I mean, who wants to hire a communication practitioner with hearing loss. And I've got lots of little things that I look back on once it's sort of penny dropped that either was impacted by my hearing loss or perhaps prejudice of bosses or supervisors about my hearing loss. So, you know, jobs became patchy. I'd be doing a high-level project and then have periods of unemployment. And one day, thinking it through, I decided to make my hearing loss a positive and came up with the concept that I branded inclusive communications, which is the idea of the theory of taking to professional PR and communications to reach audiences that aren't mainstream in the way that they receive information. So that's people like ourselves who have a communications disability. It's people with low English literacy from other cultures. And in recent years, issues like digital literacy, and even most recently, things like trusting your news sources are sorts of areas that I put in all together under inclusion. Personally, though, as an individual, I bit off too much for one person to develop a new field of work, market the idea, obtain work, and then deliver it. So while the concept is excellent, as a stable source of income, it unfortunately didn't take off for me. Now, a few more years down the track, my hearing has drifted into the severe category, and I'm on my 4th set of hearing aids, and I'm really happy for NDIS that I drifted into that, because I've been able to get a few extra supports and things which I couldn't afford otherwise. But it's been very obvious to me that the depth of how my hearing loss has affected my life way beyond employment and financial. It's had major impact on my health and significant challenge on my social confidence, connections with people, and life in general. I continue to work championing inclusion in communications, and I now combine this with health consumer advocacy, which is something I stumbled into about 5 years ago. And that's definitely another story, not for tonight. So I think I've probably said enough. I'm happy to answer questions later. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. That was fantastic. And it sounds really hard, especially when you're talking about how long it took you to, number one, like even consider the possibility that you were living with a hearing condition. If you don't know what that looks like, then it's really hard to recognize it when it's happening. And number two, what you were saying about, like, it took you 2 years to get the hearing aid, even when you knew that you needed that, and then like the stigma was still there even when you had it, like struggling with that stigma.
But then how common is that out in the community? So I mean, I was in my 40s and I'd already known for a few years that I probably would need hearing aids. Now the joke is I'm an early adopter of technology, but at any age people have stigma. So other people will have stories that I'm sure touch on stigma and reluctance that unfortunately I'm far from the only one.
Absolutely. I think it's one of the key themes that we see emerging in generally people's experience of this. And one of the things that I found like really that I find really inspiring about your talk is the fact that you took all that and decided to do something with it and kind of embed it into your work so that other people didn't have to go through the same thing. So with that note, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Maxine Parker. Maxine Parker is a business owner and operator of AccessAbilityAustralia, and she refers to her work as a privilege, with a passion and just cause having a primary benefit to others. Her work actively seeks to decrease barriers for people living with disability to access community and to support inclusion and capacity development. Living with her own disability and utilizing her professional experience, it is Maxine's vision to have an idealized state of authentic inclusion and attitudinal shifts within community that prove beneficial for people living with a disability. So without further ado, I give it the floor to you, Maxine.
Thank you, Lou, and hello everyone, good evening. Thank you all for being here to listen to our stories. So like Andrea, I have written down a few notes this evening. I thought it was really important to capture each different stage of my journey, and I didn't want to accidentally miss any information out. So I will apologise in advance for reading off some notes. So when Soundfair first approached me with the opportunity to actually come on tonight and share my journey, I must admit the theme itself I found actually quite daunting. The theme of diagnosis the first day I knew almost shut me down fairly soon, to be honest, but then I thought a little bit more about it, and I realised the importance of actually addressing this particular theme, particularly for a person with a new diagnosis. Had I known then what I know now, I would not have had as long a journey and as painful as a journey that I had. So I think it's really important that we are here this evening, and I do thank Soundfair in advance for actually challenging me with this particular theme. So this evening, what I hope to do is take you on a 7-year journey, of my own, from diagnosis to healing. I am to explore some milestone firsts along the way, and also share with you some formidable findings throughout those years that I experienced. So for me, my hearing loss journey began in 2015. I'd actually been away on a school camp with a whole bunch of very, very active and excited children. And consequently, as a result of an exhausting week, I came back run down with a head cold and a sinus infection. Now, part of that also was a blocked ear. So for those of you who have been swimming and you've had that sensation of that blocked ear feeling, or had a head cold where you've had that blocked ear, basically that's what I was experiencing. Slowly after about a month, the blocked sensation disappeared, but I never felt as though my hearing actually came back to its full normal. Then again, exactly to a year to that date in July 2016, exactly the same thing happened, following yet again another school camp. This time, it probably took me around 3 months of trying all different things to try to clear that blockage. I tried antibiotics, sinus sprays, decongestants, inhalants, and nothing was working. So eventually I went along to my GP, who referred me to an ENT doctor, who sent me off for some scans. Now, this is my first I knew moment that I'll share with you this evening. This was when my hearing test came back with perfect hearing in my right ear, but moderate to significant loss in my left. The MRI that the ENT doctor had sent me for actually showed an acoustic neuroma of around 2 centimetres in size. For those of you who don't know, an acoustic neuroma is a benign tumour that starts to grow on the part of the ear, the cochlear part of the ear, and unfortunately starts to grow in towards the head and the brainstem. So I was referred instantly to a surgeon at the Alfred hospital, where I was very, very fortunate to get the head of the ENT unit at the Alfred, as well as the head of neurosurgery also at the Alfred, to actually undertake my surgery. I was actually given at the time 2 different options in terms of surgery. One surgery potentially may have preserved what hearing I had left in my left ear, but it didn't give the surgeons a very good access route to the actual acoustic neuroma. So I opted for a different surgery that unfortunately would leave me with no hearing whatsoever in my left ear. I did have to sacrifice my hearing, and I did have to risk several other things, such as potential facial paralysis, which I did have temporarily, but thankfully that has rectified itself now, but the hearing sadly never will. So the strange thing, I guess, for me at the time as well, prior to having my surgery, was I identified I had a loss of hearing in my left ear, but I did not realise to what, I guess, extent I had hearing loss. I actually thought at that point in time it was fairly significant. And this is where I bring you to my next I first knew moment, because following surgery, which was 11 hours long, as it so turned out, it was a very extensive, long surgery with full removal of the neuroma. It wasn't until after the surgery that I realised how much hearing I had actually lost. I hadn't actually lost, how much I actually had, but following surgery, how much the difference it was between no hearing and what was remaining, is what I'm trying to say. So part of the surgery also for me was having to have my balance nerve severed in order for the surgical team to reach the tumour. So another first I knew moment came for me when I realised I had absolutely no balance whatsoever. I spent the next 2 days following surgery unable to open my eyes, unable to sit up, unable to move to a sitting position, and certainly unable to get anywhere near standing. Every time I would open my eyes and attempt anything of the sort, the room just did complete 360s, and it was extremely uncomfortable and would certainly make me feel very nauseous. The poor young physiotherapist at the time, who would come to my bedside on several times a day, didn't stand a chance in the first 24 to 48 hours. I actually hated the sight of him because of how he would make me feel by trying to encourage me to do the right thing. But I was told the quicker that I did the right thing and got up and got moving, the quicker recovery would be for me. So within a couple of days, thank goodness, I was up and about, very slowly moving around. And at the time, I think I felt like I had climbed Mount Everest. So after 5 days of being in hospital and trying to somewhat adjust to having single-sided deafness, it was time to go home. And this was where I guess I had my next I first knew moment, because life as I knew it had gone and I had to begin a new life. It was a new me, and I had to discover what that meant, what it looked like, not just for me, but for those around me and for my professional working life as well. I knew that there would be limitations on me in terms of what I could and what I couldn't do. I'd always been an active, fit person, and something like this just knocked me for six emotionally and physically. I would sort of go out for short little walks around the block to try to recover some balance and to try to bring some normality back into my life. I did a lot of balance exercises, which I sourced for myself, either online or from an exercise physiologist who I had engaged with prior to my surgery. I guess my new norm took some adjusting. It took some adjusting too. I found my new norm actually very exhausting, because the physical act of having to try to listen so much harder was extremely draining, physically and emotionally and mentally. I would go to bed in the evenings absolutely exhausted. Everything that I seemed to do seemed to exhaust me so much more as I went through that adjustment phase of my new norm. A month after losing my hearing really came, I guess, my next I first knew moment, when I began to notice a much more widespread impact of my hearing loss in my left ear. And it really dawned on me at that point in time, when I began to get myself more out into community, how inconvenient it was going to be having single-sided deafness. And I actually thought, well, my hearing in my right ear was good enough and I would cope. But all of a sudden, I realised it wasn't going to be that easy. Neurologically, things just weren't the same. I had balance issues, and sounds were no longer being filtered properly. I also had tinnitus happening in the deaf ear, which sounds bizarre. And I remember asking my neurosurgeon, would the tinnitus go away after I had the surgery? And he said, likely not. And I asked him to explain to me, how can a deaf ear have tinnitus? And his explanation, although quite comical, I guess, was very straightforward and understandable. And he said to me, it's basically your brain's way of telling you that it's not getting the same signals and the same sounds and the same sensory input. Therefore, it creates a party of its own. And that's why you're getting the tinnitus sounds in the deaf ear. So unfortunately, I had the deaf ear with the tinnitus interfering with the good ear. Now, my next I first knew moment really did stop me in my tracks. And I can't remember how far into my journey this happened, but I know it was very soon on. I'd gone back to driving, which was 3 months after surgery. So it was probably soon after that. And when I say it stopped me in my tracks, it gave me a huge wake-up call, because what actually happened is I nearly got myself run over. So I was in a car park, and nobody told me to actually look left when I was in a car park. I just instantly crossed the road and almost got myself knocked over, because didn't realise there was a car coming because I didn't hear it. So nobody talked to me about safety. Nobody talked to me about the difficulties I would experience in noisy environments. Nobody talked to me about the need to strategise before socialising. Nobody talked to me about the awkwardness of having to say, pardon, I'm sorry, could you repeat that, over and over and over. Nobody talked to me about the social isolation that may present itself after hearing loss. I wasn't given any guidance in terms of how to navigate my new normal, and I wasn't given any strategies as to how to overcome community challenges. I also wasn't given any exercises to maintain or improve my balance other than the ones I sought out myself. I had to independently source all of this information whilst navigating a whole new me. I wasn't provided with any emotional wellbeing support either to overcome my loss, and nor were my family given any information in terms of how to best communicate with me or support me through this. My hearing loss journey, I guess for me, certainly has presented its fair share of challenges. And I like to liken, I guess, this journey for me as an educational experience that's really facilitated some new learning for me, which I'm always very keen for. Certainly a lot of acquisition of knowledge and skills, as well as some new values and habits. I've had to, I guess, retrain myself and those around me. I've had some great opportunity for storytelling, such as this evening. And I've met some wonderful people along the way as well, which have certainly, supported me and encouraged me to continue on with the work and the storytelling that I'm doing. And look, to be honest, as time has passed, I have come to accept that this is my new normal, and even to an extent become somewhat grateful for this experience. And I know, as difficult as it has been, it has led to some growth for me, some personal growth that has helped me to become more resilient. And I'd like to just finish off this evening with my first I knew moment. And that really is to recognise the new pathways in my life that this opportunity has brought. I now work really hard, as Lou mentioned, in my business to advocate for people with disability within community, to have more inclusion and better opportunities. Leading and living with disability has definitely improved my level of empathy for others. And I'm now able to identify with the challenges that other people face throughout life with their own disabilities and challenges, and look at it from their perspective now that I'm living that as well. And without a doubt, and with the supportive help of organisations like Soundfair and those around me who have also supported me throughout this, I now have the confidence in my ability to heal and to overcome the obstacles and challenges of hearing loss. So thank you for letting me share my story this evening, and I look forward to talking to people again at the end.
Thank you so much, Maxine. Thank you for sharing. And yeah, again, such a powerful story. And I think you raise very important points when you talk about how, because no one gave you all this information, not just in terms of what to expect physiologically, but psychologically, emotionally, socially, like all these aspects of your life that would be impacted if you had no way to set expectations. So that results in being like incredibly distressing because you're navigating a journey blindfolded, pretty much.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're spot on there. And like I said in the beginning, had I known now what I knew, had I known then what I know now, my journey would have been a lot shorter and a lot less painful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Maxine.
Pleasure.
I'd like to give the floor now to Victoria. Victoria Didenko is an Australian actress and performer that has starred in commercials, television productions, theatre and voiceovers from the age of 7. She has been and continues to be happily married to the love of her life for 36 years and is a mother of 2 children who have grown and blossomed into exemplary young men. In 2014, Victoria started experiencing a loud electrical buzz in her head. Today, 7 years later, it still hasn't gone away. She now knows she suffers from tinnitus. Victoria, I give the floor to you to share your story.
Thank you, Lou. Just reminding everybody, and for those who don't know what tinnitus sounds like, this is what I've been told by my doctor and my ear, nose and throat specialist, that it's comfortable to live with. People cope with this and you'll be fine. I hope you can hear it. Listen carefully. It's happening in a minute. Can you hear? The day I first knew that I had a symptom known as tinnitus was one of the most despairing, frustrating and disappointing days in my life. I'd been experiencing a high-pitched sonic shrill whistling noise in my head for about 3 weeks. This was in 2014. I didn't really know what was happening. I tried to work through it, sleep it off, and I tried to exercise my way through it. I was frenetic. I just thought I was going to explode with sound. I lost my sense of self. I wasn't there. I was just sound. I was so frightened. I ran, I jogged, I swam, I hiked, I walked myself into a frenzy. I tried to relax, I tried to breathe, meditate, succumb, accept this alarming buzz in my head, but to no avail. I experienced panic attacks. I was pushed to the very edge and I wasn't coping. All the exercise, I couldn't work through it. So I realised it was time to go for help and get on top of this, address it. And that was when I went to my doctor, my GP. I went in distressed. I came out doubly distressed. My doctor couldn't help me. Tinnitus. Yeah. That's one tough gig. She told me her grandfather had it, that he suffered terribly and complained all the time and it drove him mad. It can drive you mad, she told me, my GP. I really don't think these are the things that I should have been told. I felt that at the time. I thought, this is 2014. I shouldn't be hearing something like this coming from a professional medical person. I was frightened. I was at the very end of my tether. I didn't know how I could cope another minute. I went for help. I went to my GP because that's what we're told. Go and see a GP first, and they couldn't help me. So I went in frightened and I was even more frightened. I wasn't coping and I realised that it was up to me that I was going to have to cope. So the story goes, as it is for many, and I think you'll all understand this, Maxine and Andrea and all those listening, Daniel, is that I went to have MRIs, I went to my ear, nose and throat surgeon to make sure, Maxine, that I didn't have a neuroma or anything in my ear causing this tinnitus that just arrived in my head from I don't know where. And in a way, I was sort of hoping, oh, look, in a way, I hope it's sort of a benign neuroma. They'll be able to cut it out and the tinnitus will go. And I couldn't believe how dismissive everybody was when the outcome was, and luckily, Maxine, for me, I didn't have neuroma, and my wonderful surgeon, my ear, nose and throat specialist in Melbourne, one of the top in Australia, patted me on the knee and said that all the results were clear and I had garden variety tinnitus. And I'd stop noticing it in time and everything would be all right. People cope, people are fine with it, you will be fine too. I did have an audiology test and it showed that I had mild upper frequency hearing loss, but there was no mention of having a hearing aid or trialling one in case it might help my tinnitus and fill my brain with ambient sounds. And it is known now that if people struggle and suffer tinnitus, that and you have a mild hearing loss, by wearing a hearing aid, it actually enhances ambient noises and it fills the loss where you've lost your hearing, and it can dampen the tinnitus. None of that was told to me at all. Lack of communication, no information. I was told I'd cope, that I'd stop hearing sounds, but I wasn't told how. I wasn't given the tools. I wasn't explained any management strategies. I wasn't told who to see. It was causing me great mental and emotional angst. I wasn't told to see a psychologist or a behavioural cognitive therapist. I walked out of my ear, nose and throat surgeon's surgery and I stood on the main road on the footpath, and I just thought, after all that, all those tests, all the questions, all the money that I'd spent, because hearing health, somehow ears aren't a part of health in Australia. And ears I have to pay and I don't get anything back from my private health cover. I can't believe it. I don't know why teeth and ears are not part of the national health conversation. That has to be addressed. And I just thought, I've paid all that money, I've seen all these people, and here I am, isolated, my head's roaring, and I'm no better off than I was. And I thought, I actually got angry, I got cranky, and I thought, this isn't right, this isn't right. So I've spent the last 7 years addressing this wrong. And I've launched campaigns, My Earrings for Peace, where I thought, I'll turn, like you, Andrea, I want to turn this negative into a positive. So I wanted to whirl some glamour. No one mentions tinnitus. And I just wanted to address this tinnitus. Why had I got to 55 years old and had not heard of tinnitus? No one had ever said to me that their lives are falling apart, that they had tinnitus. In fact, I thought tinnitus was a foot fungal infection, which is tinea. I really didn't know about this word tinnitus, meaning to near, to ring. And people have been suffering it. Leonardo da Vinci, Plato, way back, Pliny the Elder, they all wrote in ancient Greece about, and Italian, about this mosquito in their head, this noise. And I can't believe over these thousands of years that it's still not being addressed. It's not seen as a significant symptom. It's treated like a mere trifle, but it had me. And I know when I say this, it has millions of others. So it's not just me. So if you are experiencing tinnitus and feeling isolated, please don't. But it had me thinking, you know what? If I die, I've had a great life. I've had a great life and a gorgeous family. I've fulfilled most of the things, you know, and then I won't have to suffer this sound that drove me to despair. And that frightened me. I'm a positive person. I love life. I love people. But this tinnitus, this little benign buzz in the head, non-stop, 24/7, drove me to think very frightening thoughts of suicide ideation. That's when I went and had behavioural cognitive therapy. I found Soundfair back at the time. It was trading as Better Hearing Australia Victoria. I had to do all the work. I had to find everything. And it was hard. I trawled through cures. I rang up people. If I paid $5,000 and I listened to this particular music, my tinnitus would go away. I know a girlfriend did that. She said she was listening to Bach or Beethoven ad infinitum with a buzzing noise in her head, and she said she just felt better taking those sounds out of her brain and just coping with the tinnitus and not the Bach and the Beethoven mixed around it. So it's been a shocking journey. It's been confusing. And I'm very, very, very happy to throw all my energy into growing awareness around the tinnitus condition and hearing loss. Hearing health has to be a national health priority. People, if you've got tinnitus, don't have any stigma. Talk about it. Ask your doctor for help. Doctors really want to help, but I don't think that there's enough education in their course when they're learning to become a GP. They don't have the time to discuss the emotional side of these things, that trauma that we bring to the doctor. In 15 minutes, the way we're in and we're out these days at our GPs, I really find that they are struggling to address symptoms and hearing loss and hearing health and other hearing conditions. So Soundfair, thank you for everything you do. Hearing aids did help me. They've helped me on and off. I use them as a tool. I don't have them in all the time. Wonderful hearing apps like T- is an app I listen to, and the creator of that has tinnitus himself. I'm not a great person to trawl forums and online, I guess I call them sort of complaint sessions, but there are some wonderful podcasts. The Tinnitus Hub has a wonderful podcast where they go around and they interview researchers all around the world, and we are kept up to date with the latest research and what's going on in the tinnitus sphere. So we need to make a noise. People with tinnitus don't suffer in silence. We don't have the luxury to anyway, do we? So thank you, Soundfair, for tonight. Thank you, everybody. And Daniel, we're yet to hear your story, but we're all heroes, spelled Hearos or ES. And we're all heroes, and keep up advocating. We have a right for peace for people who live with the auditory torment of tinnitus. It's a torment, and if there are any doctors listening tonight, please treat that patient with time, with respect. Go to the Tinnitus Australia website and find out the people who you can recommend that tinnitus client to. We all deserve peace. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your story, Victoria. And I think one of the things that emerges for me is how different your story, Andrea's story, and Maxine's story are, and how each one of your hearing journeys has been a completely different journey. However, even though I guess the physiological conditions that led to them have been quite different, and even the symptomatology has been quite different, there is a common thread that Andrea highlighted in the chat about there's lack of support, there's lack of information, and most importantly, lack of empathy and understanding about what that condition entails. As you can probably tell, we're running slightly behind time, which is great because it means that we have very engaged and passionate people that are sharing their stories with us, and I've really been completely enthralled by your stories, guys. So hopefully you can all stay a little bit longer with us for the chat, but without further ado, I will give the floor to Daniel Bistrito. So Daniel was diagnosed with a progressive hearing impairment in his early teens and lost half of his hearing by early adulthood. After many years struggling professionally, he decided that he needed to make a change. He studied to become an audiometrist, and in 2017 got a cochlear implant, which proved to be life-changing. He now works for a hearing clinic as an audiometrist and as an assistive devices product manager. Daniel, I give it over to you.
Thanks, Lou. I'm what I'd like to consider to be a typical guy in his 40s. No, I'm a husband. I'm a father of 4 fantastic children. I'm a tech nerd. I love superhero movies and science fiction and everything that goes with that. I also happen to be profoundly deaf as well. So I have a cochlear implant in my left ear, and I wear a super high-powered hearing aid in my right ear. I still remember the very moment that I first discovered that I had hearing loss. I was about 13 years old, and I was at my local doctor, and he had a device called a tuning fork, which he held up to one ear and then the other, and he asked me if one was louder than the other. And it was at that point that I realized, hang on, I actually don't hear that sound from my left ear. Up until this point in time, I was totally oblivious that anything had actually changed. My assumption is that my parents must have noticed something, hence this particular appointment. I left that doctor's appointment very much in a state of shock and disbelief. It was almost like I needed to convince myself when I got home that my left ear didn't hear that well. And I remember listening to things around the house and covering one ear and then the other, as if I almost needed to convince myself that this wasn't just a bad dream. My mum was also diagnosed, I knew this was going to happen. My mum was also diagnosed with a hearing loss when she was in her early teens. She had a surgical procedure, which unfortunately was not successful and left her with permanent, profound hearing loss. Her family wasn't very supportive, and mum was encouraged to basically hide her hearing loss and not tell anyone about it. So given mum's history and, you know, whatever afflicted her was likely a hereditary thing, and not knowing any better, I decided that I probably should hide my hearing loss from anyone who didn't know about it. So when I was about 14, I got my first hearing aid. Being a typical teenager, there was no way known in a million years I was going to be seen in public, let alone at high school, with a hearing aid. Every 6 months or so, I'd get called out from class to see a visiting audiologist to test my hearing. I would try to hide this fact from my school friends, making up some lie as to where I was actually going. And I remember feeling really anxious in the days leading up to this test, and thinking to myself that maybe if I tried hard this time, I'd actually be able to pass the hearing test, but that, you know, wasn't going to be. Well, I was far from being a problem child while I was at school. Now that I think back on it, I begin to wonder how many of my so-called behavioural issues actually came down to the fact that I just wasn't hearing as well as I thought I was. I was referred to an ear, nose and throat specialist who diagnosed a condition called otosclerosis. At the time, my right ear was still at a good level. And I was told that generally this condition does affect both ears over time, but I still had good hearing in my right ear and I hadn't really noticed any difference. So I thought, hey, you know, I can continue to hide this. Fast forward now to the end of high school. I was about to begin a university course, and during the summer break, I was scheduled to have a surgical procedure called a stapedectomy. This was the first ever surgical procedure I'd ever had. Naturally, I was nervous and apprehensive about that. But this was also the type of surgery that didn't go right for mum, and effectively, you know, made her hearing worse. The surgeon assured me, saying that, look, this was generally a procedure that had a high success rate. So I went into it with high expectations. Waking up from that surgery, I remember waking to the worst sense of dizziness and nausea I've ever had in my entire life. It was like being on a continuous roller coaster ride that I just couldn't get off. Eventually that did subside, and when they did testing afterwards, they determined that the procedure was initially successful. However, about 2 or 3 months after that, something happened. One moment I was fine, next moment it's almost like somebody just pressed the button, and it was like this instant dizziness button, and I just collapsed to the floor in a vomiting mess. And to this day, I still don't know what actually occurred. I remember hearing some phraseology about a condition, a thing called labyrinthitis. As I say, I don't know what it was that actually happened, but all I do know is that it actually totally wiped out all the hearing in my left ear. So at this point, I could, I suppose, no longer pretend that I was like everybody else. I had no remaining hearing in my left ear. And at this point, the hearing in my right ear actually started to get worse. I was constantly worried that that dizzy episode was going to come back. And I got really angry. I literally started blaming every person that I possibly could blame. You know, this was unfair. Why did this happen to me for? I just want to be normal. My hearing specialist at the time advised me against the cochlear implant. Cochlear implants were still relatively new, and there was still a lot, I suppose, we needed to know about them. And the advice he gave me that was because the right hearing in my right ear was still okay, my brain would not be able to cope with the difference in signals. And he more or less totally advised me against it. And that was something that stuck with me for a number of years. And I was always constantly scared of cochlear implants. Further surgery on my right ear wasn't an option. No surgeon would even touch me because they basically were saying is if something goes wrong with the right ear, you're going to be permanently deaf. So I just had to deal with it. It was at about this time I got my second hearing aid. In all my life, I've never really had to wear glasses, but I still had this thing that I don't want people to know. So this device was quite clever. It was disguised as a pair of glasses, and what it did is it transferred the sound from my left ear through the bridge of the glasses over to a little receiver that was in my right ear. So it's a hearing aid in disguise. So I can actually brag that I once wore glasses to help me hear. University life wasn't easy for me. I think this was really, I suppose, the first time I needed to grasp the reality that, hey, your hearing's a problem. It was the first time I ever spoke up to anybody who wasn't immediate family about it. And at La Trobe University, there was somebody called a disability liaison officer, and she got me connected with somebody who would basically sit next to me in lectures and take notes, which meant that I could then record the lecture on, you know, a little tape device. And when I got home at night, I'd have to basically replay the recording, read through the notes that she had taken, and then once I'd understood what the lecture was about, I could then actually commence my homework. It was exhausting, to say the least. It was so exhausting. I can't even begin to tell you how stressful that was. After uni, it was time to find a job. I suppose we all hate going through job interviews. They're a daunting process as they are. And I think it's safe to say that I made an absolute mess of quite a number of job interviews simply because I just wasn't hearing that well. I still recall one particular interview where the guy just gave me this look like I was an absolute idiot. And I walked out of there feeling about this small. And I think what had happened is obviously I've misunderstood the question that he had asked me, or answered totally inappropriately. Eventually, I did secure work with an internet service provider, and I worked in their quality assurance department. And it was at this particular point in my life that I suppose I got my hearing wake-up call. So, like Maxine, there was an incident that happened where I was crossing a street in the CBD of Melbourne, and I was there with a group of my work colleagues, and I didn't hear that there was a tram coming down on my left-hand side. And if it wasn't for the intervention of one of my colleagues who literally, you know, yelled, "Daniel, tram," and grabbed me and yanked me back, I've no doubt in my mind that, you know, that could have potentially been fatal. That was a massive wake-up call for me. But in my ignorance, I still decided to trudge along and just ignore the hearing loss and pretend like everything was okay. I moved into another role at a different company, probably one of the biggest telcos worldwide in Australia. And at this point, I had a return incidence of this dizziness, which then affected the hearing in my right ear quite substantially. And I needed to ask for help. This is the first time, in my professional career, I'd actually asked anyone for help. And I don't think my employer was really understanding or supportive of what it meant to have a hearing loss. One example was where they had me placed. We were in a large open plan office area. And where my desk was placed, I basically had my back to where the majority of the office traffic was. So if anyone needed to come up and ask me something, they were literally coming up from behind me on my left side. So unless they sort of stood in a certain position or tapped me on the shoulder, I didn't know they were there. And I started to develop this reputation in the office of, being standoffish. Daniel's rude. You say hello to him, he doesn't say hello back. And I had a simple solution. I just asked them, I said, can you just move to this desk which is over there, so I'm actually going to be facing the other direction, so I'll be able to see, if anyone wants to come and talk to me. But they weren't really accommodating, and I couldn't see why the amount of effort that was involved in moving my desk, was worth it. So I had to come up with my own solution, which was I asked my wife, those little mirrors that you use when you put your makeup on? Could I have one? And she looked at me really weirdly. But what I ended up doing was I put it in the bottom corner of my monitor, so if anyone was coming up, I'd actually see them. Going through this sort of environment at work when you have a hearing loss, I literally went through the absolute deepest pits of hell. And that's not an understatement. Nobody understood what hearing loss was like. If people wanted to get my attention, I thought the best way to do it was to stand up. Remember, this is an open plan office. There's maybe 200 people in the entire floor. They thought the best thing to do was just stand up and just call out my name loudly. And then when I didn't respond, it was this big joke that, haha, Daniel hasn't heard us again. Then they come up with this really fantastic idea in their minds, which was to get my attention by throwing a tennis ball at me. So I'd be in the middle of doing, whatever it was I was doing, and so all of a sudden this tennis ball would hit me in the head, and I'd need to then turn around and see who it was that was trying to get my attention. Now I wouldn't stand for that. There's no way known in hell I would stand for that now, but back at that time, my sense of self-worth and my self-esteem was so low, and I hated not being able to hear so well, and I didn't want anyone to know that I didn't hear so well, so I just accepted, well, that's just the way it's got to be. Meetings at work, I found it was often easier to just not contribute at all. There's nothing worse than when you want to take part and you ask a question or you share your input and you're told, well, we already addressed that point. Or what you're saying has no relevance at all to what we're talking about. So it just became easier just to shut up and not say anything. Even when I got to work, my routine more or less involved, I'd get to work, take out my iPad, put the earbuds in, and just listen to music through the whole day. Because if I was doing that, I mean, I didn't have to talk to anyone. And I didn't have to talk to anyone, I mean, I didn't have to struggle through a conversation. I became really socially withdrawn. I became really depressed. I hated where I was. It was a toxic environment, but I was so scared to leave and to go through the whole daunting process of having to look for a job and go through interviews again. And I thought in my mind, who on earth is going to want to hire a guy who can't hear? That's how small my sense of self-esteem was. My biggest saving grace was my wife. She had this unique way of getting me to change the way that I was thinking. And I started to slowly accept that, okay, well, look, I can't change the fact that I don't hear so well. What I can change is my attitude. In the past, up until that point, if I misunderstood something that somebody said, and everyone who has hearing loss has gone through the whole never mind routine, and it's one of the worst things you can ever say to somebody who has hearing loss if they don't understand what you're saying is never mind, because that gives us the message that you don't care or that we're not important. So what I would then do is, if I misunderstood something that somebody said, and I would only do this with people that I knew well enough, rather than sort of say, oh, I don't know what you're saying, I would repeat back to them exactly what it sounded like to me, and often with a really confused tone. I'll give you an example. We had gone away on holidays, and we had had a really busy day out. And as we've got back to our accommodation, my wife has said, oh, geez, after all that activity, I need a nanny nap. And I've just looked at her and I said, what do you mean you need an enema? Because that's what it sounded like to me. And she laughed at it. She said, Daniel, you're an idiot. And I learned that the biggest thing was basically learning to laugh at yourself. Because if you can laugh at yourself, you're not so concerned about people laughing at you. I knew I had to get out of this toxic environment at work, because it was literally, it was killing me inside. So I looked around at other options that were available, and I decided that there was a course that I could do on audiometry. And I thought, what better job for me to get into, because I've lived hearing loss. I've been through every extent of hearing loss that's possible. There's nothing that comes with hearing loss that I haven't gone through. And I thought, you know, I've got this experience that I can share that with other people, and nobody has to go through the crap that I did. So I got into that course, and I needed to find a clinic to do my clinical placement at. And I just randomly mailed people, and someone who I will always be indebted to is Dr. Elaine Saunders. I approached her and I said, look, can I do voluntary work? And she saw me for who I was. She saw me for the value that I could bring to the role. And she said, look, no, Daniel, I want to offer you a job. So I started there as an intern audiometrist. I've been working for them ever since. And this change in attitude was what prompted me to re-look at cochlear implants and see whether or not it'd be a possibility for me. So I went through the assessment process, every step of the way, fully expecting that they were going to knock me back. But I went through the process. I had the cochlear implant. I'm running short of time. I'm sorry, so I'm going to cut this really short. And that was probably the best thing that I could ever possibly have done. So lessons I took away from that is, denial of hearing loss is a negative thing. You don't do yourself any favors. The moment I started accepting my hearing loss and, not letting it define me, but me defining my hearing loss, that's when things turned around. And look, I'm hearing better now than I ever have. Now, what was my biggest weakness has now become my greatest strength. So I think it was Victoria before that said, we are heroes. We are definitely superheroes. And, we've just got to keep advocating for ourselves and break through that stigma. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And I'm so sorry that we need to cut timing. I really wish we had more time, because I'm so engaged with all of your stories, and I feel you all have way much more to say about your journeys than what 10 minutes allow. I think one of the things that really struck out for me was the importance of the social support that your wife represented when you were dealing with that denial and that stigma, and the self-worth was being impacted, and how that helped you kind of start building the confidence to start looking at different avenues in which how you could engage with what you were dealing with, and then look for solutions. And I guess that kind of underlines the importance of how it's not an individual journey, but how our networks also can play a huge role, be it positive or negative, in how we live our journey. There is a question that has been posed in the chat that I think Andrea was kind enough to answer, but I'd like to pose it to everybody. So if you all want to stay, we're going to run until 8:15. So if anybody has any questions, please pop them onto the chat, and we'll have a few more minutes. If you have to go, totally understandable. So the question that we have is, hold on, give me a second. I'm trying to scroll up. It says, you have all shared stories of hearing loss, sudden or gradual. Have any of you had any suggestions from GPs or radiologists to learn Auslan? And it's open for Daniel, Victoria, Andrea, or Maxine, whoever wants to answer.
I've already typed an answer. First of all, Auslan has never been professionally suggested to me. And in my case, personally, I don't think it is an advantage beyond I should learn some basics for emergency communication than anything else. The thing with Auslan is who you're going to talk to Auslan with. So it's a very important decision at what stage of your life you have hearing loss, whether it's going to be an advantage to you in terms of the people you interact with. So that's my view. It is another language. It is a different, as I understand, very different way of thinking. It's not just using signs for English sentences. It's a totally different language. So it has a place. In my case, certainly not a priority.
Thank you, Andrea. For this part, like the 5 minutes that we got for opening questions and Chant, if anybody wants to say something, it doesn't have to be a question, it can be a comment. And again, Daniel, Victoria, Maxine, or Andrea, like if you want to say something, you're more than welcome to say that too. If you could please raise your hand, and then I'll give you the floor on the Zoom. Okay, Maxine?
Yeah, just on the topic of Auslan, I did enrol in a course recently, and I haven't had time as yet to start that course, but the reason for me as to why I enrolled in the course in the first place was because of the fact that I only have one good ear left. And my concern was that should anything happen to that good ear, I have a backup form of communication ready to go.
Thank you, Maxine. Jessica?
Hello, everybody. Fabulous stories. So thank you, everyone who's shared their story tonight. And it's been really great to see this journey of what I think we call self-actualization. And I was just trying to look up the definition of that, which whatever this site is that I'm on says is the psychological process aimed at maximising the use of a person's abilities and resource. And that may vary from one another, but it's sort of that journey of learning to use what you've got. And I can see people initially feeling burdened by having to ask for their needs and nearly to almost build assertiveness skills. So I was really interested to know, knowing what you know now and where you are now and sort of the power that you've gained through your experiences and what you've learned out of necessity, what would you go back and say to your former self in the position? How would you support them in that to sort of get where you are now?
I can answer that. Look, if I could go back in time and speak to, you know, myself when I was younger, I think the biggest thing I would really tell myself is don't hide it. Like things are going to be okay. There is definitely life after death. I can attest for that. And I think acceptance is the biggest thing. The sooner people can accept that they have a hearing loss, the sooner they can get on with life. And I think the other thing is really talk about it. My biggest mistake I made was I tried to keep it to myself. Hearing loss doesn't just impact you, it impacts everyone else that you have to deal with. So talk about it. If you don't feel like people understand, give them that understanding, because that's the only way they're going to understand. You've got to give them that understanding and break through the stigma.
Thank you, Daniel. Does anybody else want to answer that question too?
In terms of point in my life, for me, it's been such a gradual thing. So when I first found out I had a mild loss, it was a quick acceptance at that point because it sort of fell into place. I think it significantly, though, impacted on my marriage failure. and looking back at my whole socialization, my whole life, has had a massive impact on that aspect. On the other hand, it's actually made me who I am. But, I guess at different times I've talked about hearing loss. I've worn hearing aids for many years. I'm much more out there now, but my hearing's much worse. But people do not understand. My closest friends and family finally now in the last 12, 18 months have stopped asking me, are you wearing your hearing aids? It would be very rare for me to walk out the door. I mean, I put them in shortly after I get up and they're in all day. I wear my hearing aids full time. So when they were saying to me, are you wearing your hearing aids? It's not only a put down, but it's a lack of understanding that they don't make your hearing normal. And I think one of the, this is part of the wider society issue. Every single person's story has had a common thread of a lack of support, a lack of even the professionals giving the support, let alone wider society understanding it. The other thing that I think is really important when I was just putting my story together was in my early 30s, I went straight to an ENT. I went to my GP and ENT. I didn't think about hearing aids. But if you speak to people, maybe when they're younger, they go to an ENT. When they're older, they walk straight into a hearing aid shop. They should be going to an audiologist or an ENT, what is appropriate, but they shouldn't be going with the attitude of a hearing aid shop, that the hearing aids is the solution. So we've got a massive societal thing that we need to work on. And I'm just really happy that I also found Soundfair when it was still better hearing, and that hopefully I can contribute beyond myself. So, and I'm flattered to be amongst the company I'm amongst.
Thank you, Andrea. There's one question for Maxine. It says, I was wondering, Maxine, about decision making. Did you feel well informed to make the decision about treatment? Was there something particular that helped with this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was extremely fortunate to have a very, very competent, supportive surgical team at the Alfred Hospital. And I have lost count as to how many pre-visits I had prior to surgery, where I was basically sat down and walked through and talked through every possibility, every option that I actually had. I also managed to get in touch with an organisation called, I think they were called, I can't remember the name of them now, Acoustic Neuroma Australia or something along those lines, where obviously they were made up of a bunch of people who had been through the same sort of experience. But really the surgical team were the ones that informed me and helped me to make my decision, gave me a lot of information to read. I also, being the person I am, came home and did a lot of my own research. So I did feel very informed come the time to make the decision I made. And for me, my priority at the time, it wasn't so much about preserving my hearing. It was more about the full removal of the acoustic neuroma. I was told also at the time that there was a possibility that I could have had some radiation therapy, but I was advised against that also because there isn't enough known about that. And the one thing that they did know for certain about that was that it may cause malignancy later on in life for patients who have that at a younger age. So I knew straight away that wasn't an option for me. So I did go for the more invasive option, which did leave me with loss of hearing, permanent loss of hearing in my left ear, but did give me a successful surgical outcome. Thank you, Maxine.
On that note, I'd like to thank you all for sharing your stories with us today and for being, I think it takes a lot of courage to share something so personal and so raw in a setting like this. So thank you for not only for sharing your stories, but for all the work that you're doing on a daily basis to advocate, to make change, and to make sure that other people do not have to go through the hurdles that you had to go through, making it better a little bit at a time. In terms of that, Soundfair is all about centering lived experience. All the advocacy work that we're doing is trying to put personal stories at the core of everything that we do, because we want to make sure that change is evidence-based and that we're actually responding to the needs of people that are living with hearing conditions. So if anyone that's today in our audience would like to share their story or knows anybody that has a story that needs to be told, please get in touch with us. We're always on the lookout, and we'll make sure that that informs everything that we, not only that we do, but the recommendations that we put forth to health professionals, to government, and to all the stakeholders that we work with on a daily basis. If you like today, please spread the word. Tell your friends. If you didn't, don't say anything. If you didn't, please let us know. Please let us know what worked, what didn't, what can we do better. Again, this was our first session, so we understand that it was a bit of a trial and error. We clearly needed more time. But thank you so much for joining us. The next session is on the 1st of July, again at 7 p.m. So your night will be on the first Thursday of every month. And our next session is focused on writing to be heard. So we're going to have 3 authors, one photographer, Kate Disher-Quill, who wrote Earshot. We're going to have Fiona Murphy, who wrote a memoir on her story. And we're going to have Darren Roberts, who wrote a children's book on his experience as a father, himself being profoundly deaf. So you're more than welcome to join us. Please tell your friends, and please stay in touch. Thank you so much, guys, and we look forward to seeing you soon.
Thanks, Luke.
Bye.